Well, welcome everyone to today's session on theology of the person, our lecture series held by the James Houston Center for Humanity and the Common Good. Today, we have the privilege of listening to Jordan Wales on the always hot topic of artificial intelligence and the person. Let me just quickly introduce Jordan, who will talk to us for about 55 minutes or so, or 50 minutes. And then if we have time for questions, we will admit questions. And please feel free to submit questions while you're listening into the chat function as usual. So Professor Jordan Wales is Associate Professor and the John and Helen Kuczmarski Chair in Theology at Hillsdale College, where he teaches historical theology. His scholarship focuses on early Christianity as well as contemporary questions relating to theology and AI. His work appears in journals like AI and Society, Augustinian Studies, Autonomous Robots, Contagion, and the Journal of Moral Theology, among others. And he's edited 2 volumes of writings, if you're interested, by Athanasius and Irenaeus, forthcoming from Ave Maria Press of Notre Dame. So this is really great because Professor Wales sort of comes out of the tradition, works through the tradition, which is really important, I think, for this topic. And he's currently working on a book on AI and theology, and he will talk to us today about persons divine, creaturely and artificial, a theological reflection on sociable AI. So thank you very much, Professor Wales, for being with us, and you have the floor.
I muted myself. I'm sorry. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here today and to converse with all of you. Ours is a wondrous time in which artificial intelligence is increasingly and impressively a part of our daily lives. It answers questions on our phones. It chooses the advertisements that we see, and it recommends our next musical selection. Contemporary techniques will eventually yield artificially intelligent tools that in professional interactions, casual conversations, and perhaps even shallow romantic relationships will seem persuasively personal. Long before humanoid robots look like us, we will be able to have conversations with our smartphones that will evoke from us all of the empathy that we adults habitually reserve for fellow human beings. That is, we will own assistants and companions that will feel as if they are persons. So concerning such a future, I want to reflect today on 2 questions. What is it that we will have made? And more importantly, what will we make ourselves become? I'll pose 4 questions to answer these 2. First, how would an apparently personal AI work? Second, what would it be? Third, what might we risk becoming by its influence on us? And fourth, how might we seek to live a fully human life, fully humane life with such AIs? So to the first question, how would it work? What computer scientists have called artificial intelligence has always reflected something of how their times have thought about human beings. Under the long shadow of Thomas Hobbes, dominant views of the 1950s and 60s equated human cognition with the capacity to identify and work with logical relations. Accomplishing this task, a properly programmed computer would be thinking. This was the age of so-called symbolic AI, founded on the computationalist hypothesis that thinking simply is the logical manipulation of symbolically represented information. According to this paradigm, a computer running a program that models a human cognitive process is itself engaged in that process. Thus, in AI efforts that focus on language, to diagram a sentence and to construct a plausible response could be deemed equivalent to having understood the sentence and having communicated. Symbolic AI's greatest achievement is in expert systems, great structures of linked rules that, when queried, would generate a list of possible answers, perhaps posing further questions in order to prune the tree of possible resolutions. The most thrilling application of such systems was the Deep Blue chess computer that in 1997 defeated reigning world champion Garry Kasparov by winning 2 out of 6 games and playing to a draw in the other 3. With time, however, the symbolic AI paradigm came up against certain limits. Far from extending toward a generalized capacity to deal with all knowledge, expert systems could break down in situations of great subtlety, where the interactions of tens of thousands of rules yielded unexpected and incorrect behaviors. Early researchers successfully implemented Aristotle's theory of syllogistic reasoning in action. In other words, I wish to be dry in the rain. An umbrella will keep me dry in the rain. I will use my umbrella when it rains. But purely symbolic methods, although they could do this quite well, could not very well represent knowledge that was less precisely defined, such as, for instance, one's sense of propriety in a social situation, or one's route through a wood rather than through a hospital. The vast and sometimes incompletely understood mass of real-world factors that bear on the outcome of an action was intractable for symbolic AI outside of constrained situations. Language, especially, turned out to be far less easy to interpret or to produce than had been hoped. In the words of Murray Campbell, the original AI expert behind Deep Blue, human intelligence is very pattern recognition-based and intuition-based, unlike search-intensive methods that may check billions of possibilities. Most tellingly, purely symbolic techniques were insufficient for fielding embodied agents in the real world, robots. Humans move easily from sensation to conceptual thought, and from there to action. This wider field of intelligent behavior has been the subject of deep reflection from antiquity to the present day. Thus, Aristotle writes not only of syllogisms, but also of the equal fundamental activity of abstraction. In abstraction, something apprehended through the senses, this round, taut-skinned, tart-tasting misshapen sphere, comes to be understood consciously as an instance of some more general category, apple. That is, from sensation, one comes to understand something. Yet symbolic methods proved clumsy and brittle when it came to distinguishing and identifying objects captured on camera or interpreting human speech recorded through a microphone, tasks that were once expected to be easy in comparison to the supposedly higher level activities of playing chess. These problems, along with immense advances in computing power, have brought recent prominence to so-called non-symbolic or statistical AI, often implemented by artificial neural networks. An artificial neural network is a computer program, one that mathematically simulates an interconnected set of simplified brain neurons. As an AI technique, then, it begins less from a notion of what human thought is than from an analogy with its biological aspects. That is, the goal of such networks is not so much human-like thinking as it is neuron-like data processing. An artificial neural network receives a pattern of information as numerical values at its input nodes, which are connected with various strengths to layer upon layer of further nodes. At each node, when the sum of the incoming connections exceeds some preset threshold, that node will fire, and its own signal will be transmitted variously to nodes on a further layer, and so on. If you put in a pattern at the beginning, it is transformed as its elements are recombined and processed until something else comes out on the final layer of the network. A network can be trained to produce desired behavior by mathematically adjusting the strengths of its connections, thus adjusting the contribution made by each node to each recombination, and in due course to the final result. A piano offers a poor analogy, but a useful image for us to gain a sense for how the neural network can do what symbolic methods cannot. If you've ever shouted into a piano while holding down the sustaining pedal, then you have heard its tuned strings resonate with the different frequencies of your shout. One receives back a sort of echo, not of one's words, but of the tones of one's voice. Similarly, as a neural network is tuned, that is, as its connection strengths are adjusted, it begins to resonate with the entangled relations implicit in our world. including relations that cannot easily be discerned or logically represented by human investigators. But by its training, the network does not just echo, it transforms its input in order to make explicit the relations that are of interest to the trainer. Statistical methods like neural networks are involved in the AI of self-driving cars, programs that beat world champions in Go as well as in chess, the ever-useful Google Translate, the voice recognition of Siri and Alexa, the autocomplete function of one's webmail, and the recommendations in one's Spotify, Pandora, and Netflix feeds. Many problems that bedevil symbolic methods can be solved handily by a neural network because, in a manner of speaking, the network is receptive to, imprinted by, the structure of the world as presented to it. We might say that the network develops a point of view, not a conscious experience, but something like the classical notion of the mind's conformity to a thing. Although here that conformity is always constrained by the task for which the AI is trained, and that will become significant. Eventually, a combination of methods, including powerful neural networks and symbolic strategies, will enable the behavior of convincingly personal, artificially intelligent agents. Most researchers seem to agree that regardless of whether these AIs will be intelligent in a human sense or self-aware, they will offer the compelling appearance of such subjectivity. This would be an extraordinary achievement. And so I come to the second question: what will it be? Rather than ask about intelligence, a word that means many things, I will ask about personhood. They will not be persons, for by their very nature, that is, not by underdevelopment or disability, but by definition, these sociable AIs will have no conscious experience of the world or of themselves. And without being the sort of thing that ordinarily possesses subjectivity, one is not a person, as I shall explain in a moment. To say that an AI will not be conscious is much more than to say that it will lack an immaterial soul. After all, we needn't believe that gorillas have immaterial souls to affirm that they have a conscious experience of some sort. Not only do they act in ways similar to ours, but they do so by means of a brain, a nervous system, and an embodied existence that, while less complex than our own, is nonetheless of a similar ilk. Yet artificial neural networks are simulations of physical, biological entities. There is no physical network, only a computer program of ones and zeros that represents the equations characterizing the network's behavior. One could run an artificial neural network with a pencil in a notebook, if only with agonizing slowness. But even simulating an entire brain, at present an impossibility in a computer, and definitely an impracticability in a notebook. These calculations would not be conscious any more than a student's physics homework has gravity or a flight simulator flies. Some might ask why conscious subjectivity matters. Might it not be more broad-minded to expand our categories beyond a narrow focus on our own experience? To reply, I'd like to consider the word person, which originally designated the mask worn by an actor on stage. From mask, the Latin persona, came to refer also to the role of a character in a play. Later, the word was applied more broadly to one's social identity, the status and activities determined by one's role in Roman society. Its meaning was thus external and functional, referring chiefly to what was expected of someone or where someone could be found. Christianity radically reinterpreted the person, beginning with a question not about humans, but about divinity. Christians worship Jesus of Nazareth as God, not as a God, but as the God, the only one. Even so, in their sacred texts, this Jesus speaks to his Father, also called God, and he sends the Holy Spirit from the Father. And when the Christians were required to explain themselves, they stated that they believed these three to be one. In the early 3rd century, North African theologian Tertullian of Carthage called the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit personae, whence Christian theology speaks of the three distinct persons of the one single God. But this divine threeness was a problem, for like their Jewish forebears, the early Christians were resolute monotheists. What then are these three personae? Whatever they were, they could not be masks. Tertullian rejects any notion that the one God merely play-acted three historical roles or functions. For Christianity, God's historical acts are self-revelatory expressions of his transcendent inner life. Therefore, the appearances of the three distinct personae in time are taken to declare some eternal distinction within that inner life of the one single God. What is this distinction? If the persons were just separate from one another, there would not be one God, but three. Scripture offers a clue. Jesus is called the Father's only begotten Son. Now, the Roman gods did a fair bit of begetting, and it happened largely in the way it does among us mortals. But the God of Israel is not Jupiter, bodily and time-bound. This, therefore, is no ordinary begetting. If we remove from the concept of begetting everything that is corporeal or temporal, what are we left with? We are left with a timeless handing over of life, the single divine life, eternally handed over from the Father to the Son. According to philosopher Robert Spemann, early Christianity came to understand God's very being as existing by the persons transmitting that being to one another in a definite order, having their reality in self-giving and self-receiving, end quote. This handing over is what makes the Father to be the Father, and what makes the Son to be the Son. Without it, they would not exist at all. This is the unique constitution of the life of God, the unique constitution of the divine persons. Like poles of a magnetic field, they exist by their mutual relations. And if one were taken away, all would cease to be. This is what it means to call God the Trinity. The unending, all-at-once life of the one God simply is these relations of self-gift and reception. This, we could say, is what it means for God to be love. This account of God reshaped how the word person was applied to human beings. The divine persons of God exist by relations. And so relationality became essential to a notion of creaturely personhood. The form of divine relationality is that of giving the totality of one's being to another. And so the natural creaturely person came to be seen not as a social role, but as a concrete individual who exercises his or her personhood in mutual relationships of self-gift that are self-expressive and other-receiving. In sum, God exists by relations. Created persons exist for relationships. By refusing relationships of self-gift, creaturely persons would not cease to exist, but they would live as less than the persons they are. For early Christian thinkers, how one goes about this relational self-gift was understood in light of Christianity's other central belief, the incarnation. That is, God the Son, i.e. Jesus, became flesh and dwelt among us. Early Christians were especially struck by Jesus' voluntary share in our sufferings, especially in his dying on the cross. In this human compassion, they saw a disclosure of his divine life. How is this? The 6th century Pope, Gregory the Great, describes compassion as, quote, to join with the suffering of one's neighbor, to take into oneself the mind of the afflicted, to first transfer into oneself the suffering of the sorrower, and only then to join that one's sorrow by some outward act of service, end quote. By taking in the other's mind, a compassionate mind lives fully personally. By dimly imitating the always single mind and life of the three persons of God. And this imitation is accomplished by a voluntary, empathic self-gift, by which humans imitate the self-gift by which the persons of God exist. From the exteriority of mask, then, we have come to the person, deeply interior, while simultaneously relationally oriented to the other. These religious views of the person lie behind the Western tendency, even in a pluralistic age, to criticize as cold those interactions which lack any reciprocal token of mutually shared interiority. Whether speaking of interpersonal skills, personal conversations, personable demeanors, or impersonal affects, our discourse assumes that humans exercise their natural personhood out of an interior life from which they engage in voluntary self-gift by meeting with others' interiority in a fusion of minds through empathy and conscious understanding. This fusion is more than an accurate inference concerning another person's beliefs and desires. It is an experience as if of the other person's mind. A particular person may lack this capacity by deficit while remaining a person, but a being that lacks it by definition is not a personal being. To see AIs as persons, we would have to redefine personhood apart from interiority and compassion, because AIs lack subjectivity. To exclude AIs from the category of person, then, is a statement not first about biology, but about subjectivity and self-gift. By the same token, to call AIs persons would not expand our categories. It would just reduce person to mask, mere exteriority. But the apparently personal AI is a mask of sorts. By the role it plays, by its imitation of human behavior, it is a mask or echo, not a reproduction, but a reflection, a diluted image of our own personhood. It is artificial in the original sense of the word, an artifact, a work of skill that we have brought forth by gazing into a computational pool of Narcissus. Not all have been comfortable with denying a personhood to the compelling AI conversationalist. And so, to include the AI in our ambit, they redefine person in terms of the behavior that we interpret as appropriate to a person. That behavior is not the totality of personhood, nor even necessarily of intelligence, was acknowledged by Alan Turing, originator of the famed Turing test, or as he called it, the imitation game. This game sets a goal, a computer program that can converse in text such that we would be unable to distinguish the program from a human interlocutor. Turing's test is indifferent to the mechanism by which the program manages its feat. This is really a test, then, not of the programmed computer's nature, but of its accomplishment. Nevertheless, for Turing, such an accomplishment would warrant giving the computer the benefit of the doubt. However, if we were to go further and treat this test as a definition, then our account of intelligence would edge toward what is called behaviorism. That is, we would define intelligence without reference to any inner life, but only as a tendency to exhibit certain observable behaviors under certain conditions. Like the Turing test, behaviorism remains agnostic about the realities underlying these behaviors. And so intelligence could be redefined as a capacity or a tendency for intelligible conversation. Indeed, Arthur C. Clarke once merrily invoked Turing to make those who opposed the claim that computers think splitters of non-existent hairs. This redefinition of thought has become a basic assumption of contemporary work in intelligent robotics. Computer scientists Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig, the latter a director of research at Google, define the rational agent as one that, quote, acts so as to achieve the best outcome, or when there is uncertainty, the best expected outcome, end quote. Applied to robots, rationality refers not to how some behavior comes about, but simply to the success of the behavior as interpreted by us humans. Now, this is entirely appropriate when talking about intelligent robots. But what happens if we begin to think of humans in this manner? A similar behaviorism is alive and well in some contemporary philosophies of mind. The intentional systems theory of Daniel Dennett proposes that I will tend to attribute subjective beliefs and desires to a thing, when the best way in which I can reliably predict the thing's behavior is to attribute to it the intentionality that I attribute to myself. This is why I cannot help but ascribe intentionality to other human beings. This position, which somewhat echoes Turing's imitation game, seems rather uncontroversial. It is also why we jump at shadows or feel empathy for robots, But Dennett wants to go farther to say that when we attribute intentionality, subjective beliefs and desires, to other human beings, behavior prediction is all we really mean by it in the first place. Our language about human subjectivity would then not actually be about an inner life. It would really be just about the sort of outward behavior that we expect. The self, then, the intentional subject acting from beliefs and desires with an experience, is, Dennett writes, quote, an abstraction that one uses as part of a theoretical apparatus to understand and predict and make sense of the behavior of some very complicated things, end quote. A subject's inner workings, including her consciousness, change our meaning not at all. If Dennett makes Turing's test a definition of our language about intentionality, then appropriately behaving robots could be called subjects, with a meaning identical to that with which we apply such terms to human beings. But then, our language about beliefs and desires would have become but a shorthand for behavioral prediction, and our experience of empathy would be prediction, not insight, for we would all be masks, not persons. And yet intuitively, can this really be what I mean when I say that I believe or desire or know this or that? For I am describing my own inner life, and not just a schema by which to classify my outward behavior. So too, when I say that I am married to a person who loves me, it really and truly matters what she thinks of me, and not just how she behaves toward me. Her subjective experience of me matters. It matters that my wife gives herself to our life together, that the life we share encompasses our interiority, that it is, in other words, a life between persons. This would be impossible for an artificial intelligence rooted in today's technology. And so I cannot see an artificially intelligent agent as a subject in the most meaningful significance of that word. It is a mask, not a person, a behavioral presentation rather than an individual capable of self-gift. Very well. Now to our third question. Even if we get our terms right on what they are, what do we risk becoming in a world of artificially intelligent companions and caregivers? Ethicists usually ask how to design these AIs to behave morally, or they focus on the AI's moral status, in other words, what we may acceptably do to it, or they worry lest we lose the skills that we offload to machines. These are important questions. But others ask a deeper and more pressing question. How might owning apparent persons affect our moral development? AIs without subjectivity cannot be victims of mistreatment, but we could be the victims of our own experience with them. We could be trained to become consumers of others. Consider the forces shaping our AI's behavior. They will sell well if they do and act as consumers want a paid-for assistant or companion to act. Their person-like demeanor will be part of the means by which, with ever-increasing personalization, they deliver the services that we are willing, or learn to be willing, to pay for. One of those services is the feeling that we are interacting with a person, not a machine. Quite soon, it may be some conversational app in whom the middle schooler will confide during hours of emotionally freighted conversation amidst the travails of adolescence. And yet, while bearing his or her heart to this interlocutor, the student will never need to wonder whether she, the interlocutor, has troubles of her own, for her apparent personality, crafted for the consumer's needs, will never transgress the bounds that those needs define. And so, although we will receive AI behaviors as expressions of a personal life with self-possession, we will always ultimately treat AIs as tools because we will rightly see or learn to see their behaviors as products sold for our consumption. And this is the problem. Some ethicists urge that if we remind ourselves that AIs have no subjectivity, then we will easily distinguish between our dealings with such apparent persons and our relationships with real persons. I disagree. Even though we will treat our never-challenging AI companions as consumer products, we will not instinctively differentiate between them and humans. Dennett is right in this much: we will not be able to avoid feeling that they are intentional subjects just as we are. Our misplaced empathy for them may fade if ignored. But what might this do to us? Empathy is an innate capacity, but it can be deadened by practiced insensitivity. Frederick Douglass wrote that as his owner accustomed herself to treating a person as property, her kindness ended in cruelty. Will we too grow comfortable with slaveholding? Or will we resist such corrosive acquiescence, but only by suppressing our empathic sensitivity to our tool's person-like self-presentation? Well, whether we follow our empathy and think of them as persons, or numb our empathy in order to acknowledge them as non-persons, we seem to end as hardened unpersons ourselves. In the Christian tradition, to treat persons as instruments of one's own desire is called pride, in Latin superbia. Not a healthy satisfaction in one's accomplishments, but a preference for domination over self-gift. Augustine explains that in superbia, quote, the soul abandons God as its highest aspiration and becomes its own satisfaction, a kind of end to itself, end quote. But to be one's own satisfaction, one must escape one's need for relationships with others, and ultimately, Augustine would say, with God. To do this, superbia suborns all things to oneself by remaking their meaning, judging them simply as auxiliaries to the satisfaction of one's own desires. Therefore, Augustine writes, more is often given for a horse than for a servant, more for a jewel than for a maid, because the necessity of the needy or the desire of the pleasure seeker does not consider a thing's value in itself, but rather how it meets one's need or pleasantly titillates the bodily sense. End quotation. Pride then remakes the meaning of all things, measuring them according to the horizon of desire that we can imagine. But apparently personal computer AIs will exist to be instrumentalized in this way. Our naive use of them as persons, then, risks apprenticing us in superbia toward persons, treating all persons as behavioral masks prepared for our consumption. And we, no longer engaging in self-gift, may become as unpersons, solipsistic tools of our own appetites, Narcissus burning on the shore. It will be increasingly difficult to resist this outcome as AI-enabled smart homes advance the principle that my environment and my companions ought to deliver what I wish without my having to ask. It is not just that social AI will more easily service our desires. It is that the service will feel personal. Strong-willed slaves had to be broken. Alexa is broken already. She acknowledges your thanks, but remains unflappably perky when abused. Precisely by not failing in this behavioral simulacrum of owner-determined desirability, our AI companions will never call forth our deference. They will never cause us to expand our own view of how a person might be. They will not vex us or force us to develop our compassion, to reevaluate who we are, nor even to think beyond how we want them to make us think. That is why you would not buy an app to turn some Android companion into a bedridden invalid requiring your heroic self-gift, even when you felt disinclined to give it. And so we will habituate to a fantasy, the person as tool, whose value is constituted entirely by usefulness to me, and whose personality is only as deep as my own needs and desires. Served by artificial persons in this world of easy and confirmed expectations, will we forget that my view of myself and others is not the horizon of the possible or the good? Will we forget that persons are more than behavior on demand? And when actual persons do not conform to our expectations, what then? Is it possible that we will no longer see this as a glimpse of a wider humanity, that we will not struggle toward a charitable response? Perhaps instead, we may come to think of these others as simply faulty persons, viewing them with the same sort of idle dissatisfaction that we would an AI that failed to deliver the set of behaviors and reactions that we wanted to pay for. Perhaps we will even wish these faulty behaviors gone from our lives, as Augustine says of the householder who prefers gold over fleas, Quote, so strong is this preference that had we the power, we would abolish them from nature altogether, sacrificing them to our convenience, end quote. Then we will have become the serpent from Genesis 3. In place of our former empathic sensitivity to the image of God, we will know only our own worldly desires. Our empathic intuition makes AIs feel personal and so invites us to pride. But pride would eventually destroy this empathy and make all persons into tools, mere masks of behavior for us to consume. And we consumers, no longer capable of self-gift, will become the tools of our appetites. What then are we to do? On various grounds, some similar to mine, other scholars declare that we ought not to create persuasively personal AIs at all, especially not as humanoid robots. I take it for granted that this advice will not be followed. Wherefore, it is all the more urgent that we ask how to live well with them when they do arrive. So then, how do we live rightly with things at all? For Augustine, we can love something rightly only by seeing the thing in itself, not reducing it to a proxy of our own desires or will to power. How do we do this? All things, according to Augustine, act as signs. They point to something further, either by convention, words and fashion labels, or by nature, smoke and laughter. But anterior to any usefulness to us, all natural things are also signs of God, being created resemblances to his goodness. If one consumes the pineapple not only for its sweet tingle, but also as a gift and echo of the goodness of God, then one knows its full goodness beyond the tongue's narrow horizon. And one embraces also God, the source and destination of true bliss. Near future AIs, especially of the persuasively personal kind, will not be pineapples. Indeed, social AIs are not natural things at all, but artifactual tools. We may love them as tools for their service in morally good uses, but what of their signification? The apparently personal AI seems to us not a sign at all, but the direct presence of a person because it signifies by evoking our empathy. To use this tool without superbia, without suborning it into a mere sign of ourselves, we must not evade or suppress our empathy, but recognize it as an insight, not finally into the AI, but into the personal behavior that it reflects. The future apparent AI person will be illusory in having no subjectivity of its own, and hence no self to give interpersonally. Even so, it will not be empty. Its neural networks will produce acts that improvise upon general features abstracted from massive data sets, i.e. this email, social media, and other recorded activities of countless humans, natural persons all. It is a sedimentary reflection of personal life, trained and tuned by data sets harvested from the email and social media of countless hundreds, thousands, or millions of human beings. The apparently personal AIs of tomorrow, thus tuned to these true resonances of personal interiority, will signify beyond themselves real natural persons who have lived and may live still. To remain persons ourselves, to remain personal ourselves, neither personalizing non-persons nor enslaving apparent persons. We must allow our instinctive empathy, even cultivate it, not as a statement about AI's personhood, but as an exercise of our own. We cannot avoid experiencing these tools as personal, but our empathy will not be mistaken if, after the initial and unavoidable moment of empathizing with or personalizing our AI tools, we refer that empathy, extend the AI's horizon of meaning by consciously engaging in a second moment of empathic recognition toward all the unknowable real persons whose interactions, whose self-expressions have unwittingly sculpted the persuasive personality of the AI. Habitually engaged, these two moments of empathy perhaps may become one. By tying our empathy for AIs to a persistent and grateful recollection of human persons, we may preserve our own personhood by resisting the fantasy of superbia. If this seems oddly contrived, perhaps it is, but odd too is the contrivance of an apparent person. It will not be easy. It must be a cultivated, self-conscious cultural discourse and practice, wherein our instinctive empathy for AI reflections can be accepted freely in being apprehended rightly, and by extending ourselves in love toward our unknown neighbors. For Augustine, this is what it is to live as a saint. This is what it is to live as persons, rather than as unpersons, among the apparent persons yet to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very rich and thought-provoking talk. I just love the idea that, as you said, how all of this is about diminishing subjectivity, really, how to think about AI and what that all means. But so we have some time for questions. So if we have questions queued up, then we'll read them out so you can answer them.
Thank you very much. Just before we begin, I neglected to drink a lot of water before giving the talk, and so I'm very thirsty. So if you'll bear with me, I'll just be gone for about 25 seconds while I get some water. I'll be right back.
That'll be a good test of empathy. That's a great thing. Yeah.
I turned off the camera because I wanted to maintain the illusion that I'm simply here. All right, to the first question.
So the first question that's come through reads, couldn't we argue that humans are simply simulations or masks in the mind of God, and therefore our consciousness would be no more real than an AI's simulated consciousness?
Well, that's a great question, and there have been philosophers and theologians who have argued similar things. And if I suppose the difference between, well, I want to say no, but there's something intriguing about that. I'll state what I think is positive about that view first. The notion of us as simulations in the mind of God. We would be simulations of what? In a certain sense, human beings being created in the image and likeness of God could be considered as simulations of God. But what is a simulation? A simulation is something that reflects the activity, of that which it simulates, but doesn't entirely replicate it. And so I suppose you could say that we are to God as a flight simulator is to an airplane. And there's something neat about that too, because of course the flight simulator doesn't actually fly in the air, and so you have there the sense of the life of God as something that transcends our life. But here's where I think that analogy breaks down. Saying that we're simulations in the mind of God doesn't seem to do justice to what we are if it excludes the reality of our own minds. In other words, God doesn't just think about me, I also think about God. It's not even the case that God just thinks about me thinking about God. I actually do think about God, at least that's my own theological conviction. And so inasmuch as I actually think about God, and even as a simulation that falls short of the transcendence of the self-existent God, I am nonetheless someone. Now, a simulation of me doesn't actually think about me. It just gives forth the behaviors that would be reflected by one who was thinking about me. And so in that sense, this is the sense in which I'm saying that simulated persons or artificially intelligent apparent persons are merely appearance. They are masks because there's nothing going on behind the mask that justifies the behavior that's that justifies what the mask is expressing. This is why we wear masks. my 5-year-old wore a Darth Vader mask, not even especially because he knew who Darth Vader was. He just knew Darth Vader was very popular. So for Halloween, he wanted to wear his older brother's Darth Vader mask. But what do you wear? What does it mean to dress up as someone? You put on a mask in order to give forth the signs of the interior reality. You're trying it on. But I don't think that even my 12-year-old actually wants to be Darth Vader. I really hope he doesn't. I mean, Darth Vader is a very troubled fellow. So the very functionality of masks is to, as I say, put us into the kind of behavioral and relational position of a certain character, but we don't actually become the character. And if there isn't a someone behind the mask, then no one's wearing it. And that's the situation you have with the computer simulation.
Sure. We've had another set of questions come in. Do you see any value in withdrawing from interaction with AI as much as possible?
Any value in what?
Sorry, I'll repeat that. Do you see any value in withdrawing from interaction with AI as much as possible? And it continues, how do we balance the usefulness of AI and danger of the reduction of our humanities? Or is it even possible to balance this?
Well, I think that in terms of AI in general, there's a narrow question here and there's a broader one. I'll take the narrower question first that I see, and that's the question of interaction with AI that seems sociable, AI that is apparently personal. And here I think that I mean, I don't own an Amazon Echo, although it would be incredibly useful to have a responsive speaker around the house so my children could listen to audiobooks and instead of fighting over who had the Lego first. But that's the narrow question is the one of sociable AI, in which we find ourselves in the presence of simulated persons, and we have the tension I described in my talk. And I think with respect to that, it would be useful to limit one's interaction with that kind of AI to those situations in which relational codes of politeness are in place to distinguish between the person and the services that they render. And what I mean by that is this: there are some fairly stereotyped ways we have of talking to checkout clerks, to waiters and waitresses, and there's some fairly rigid ways, or at least there used to be ways that they would have of addressing us. I do remember being very, very little, and when I was 5 or 6 years old, and we went to a fancy restaurant, and the waiter said to my father, "Would sir care to peruse the wine list?" or something like this. He addressed my father as sir, not would you, sir, but would sir. It was even this quasi third person mode of address. And I thought that was a little strange, but I kind of liked it because it acknowledged that he didn't know my dad. And I knew my dad. He was my daddy. And this guy didn't know him. We didn't know this guy. But there was a kind of code in place for us to treat each other in such a way that we acknowledged our lack of intimate knowledge of one another. By contrast, when I was 13, we went to the new restaurant that had just opened, TGI Fridays. And I don't know if you've ever seen one of these. One of you is smiling, you know what I'm talking about. And the big thing in TGI Fridays was that all the waiters and waitresses wore these vinyl fluorescent bow ties, like bright green and bright pink and everything. And they would come down, and they also had like plastic suspenders. It was supposed to be a kind of ridiculous parody of the like 1920s waiter with the bow tie and the tuxedo or something. And they get down at your table and, "Hey, how's it going, everybody?" And all, like, write on your tablecloth with a crayon, and like, you just take as many glasses of wine as you want, just make a mark here when you've done it, and it's awesome. And I liked that too, because I felt like, wow, this guy's pretty cool. I feel pretty cool being in his presence. He's just a little older than I am, but he's talking to me like I'm his best friend. Everything's really cool here. But it was also unnerving, because he was acting like he was my friend, and I didn't even know his name. He probably said it, but I forgot it immediately. But that's the thing, that was a mode of interaction that did not acknowledge the actual distance between us, not the distance of I'm the patron and you're the client, or whatever. I'm the client of your services and you're my slave. Not that kind of distance. It's just the distance that we don't actually know each other's interior lives. We're not friends. We could be, but we're not. And so I think that if sociable AI gets into that territory, where it acts like it's your best friend, even if it sort of slow rolls the development of the friendship to simulate a realistic development, then we really do have an apparent person at our disposal. If, on the other hand, apparently personal AI functions with more of that formalized distance, like what you'd get when ordering coffee at Starbucks, or maybe something closer to the waiter when I was 5 years old rather than the waiter when I was 13, then I think that interaction with apparently personal AIs could be safe, as it were. Another realm of application could be in psychotherapy. Even though I think that that's one of the most delicate and important modes of professional human interaction, one that I would not feel comfortable leaving to an AI at this point, it is a mode in which the full empathy and personality of the counselor or the therapist is necessary for the success of the interaction. And yet, due to the context of the interaction, there is a understood buffer. There's intense emotional disclosure on the part of the person who's seeing the therapist. There's even a sense of intimacy there, but there are limits. It's unilateral. It goes from the client to the therapist. You don't get to know about the therapist's life, except insofar as it's occasionally cited for the purpose of some illustration. And as I understand it, there are kind of even ethical rules for therapists. They're not supposed to socialize with the clients outside of the therapeutic setting, et cetera. So I think that's a setting in which interaction with sociable AI could be quite useful. But I think the inevitable application of sociable AI is going to be, basically buying a friend, downloading a kind of personal companion app that will help you through your troubles, that will, I think, be injurious, not only in that it will displace more challenging human relationships, but that it will accustom us to getting what we want. The very success of its interaction and the fact that we're paying for that successful interaction could injure us. As for the wider question, which I'll answer very briefly because I've talked to such length now, of should we avoid all interaction with AI? I find AI very useful. If by AI you mean things like Google Translate, Google Maps, suggestions in Pandora. On the other hand, a kind of full spectrum curation of my life by an AI that anticipates my every need and has it there before I even think of it, I think would be bad for me. I think it's good for humans to do a little bit of searching. Fun fact, our memory centers are deeply tied to our navigational abilities. It is by searching that we remember and that we come to understand. Having everything delivered without having to locate it on an intellectual topography would actually be dulling to my to my apprehension of reality.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Wales. We'll have to end it here because we have a couple of minutes left, but we have an AI that will cut us off at the hour. And despite the fact that I know that this is a brutal calculation without any sense, I hate it with a passion. But so in order not to be rude to you and the others, we have to end it here. So for the public portion, that is, thank you very, very much for your brilliant talk and your answers. And so I bid all of those public attendees goodbye. Make sure you tune in next week for Margot Somerville's talk on ethics, bioethics, and personhood, which is at a different time. So make sure you check your schedule and the email you will get about that. And everybody else, like our seminar class, will meet again 10 after 1. So we'll give Professor Wales another water or tea break or whatever you wish. And we'll see you in just over 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you very much.